The contractions started at 2:47 in the morning, and Diane Whitfield was alone. She remembers the exact time because she watched it change on the clock above the hospital bed, watched the green numbers blur through tears she refused to let fall in front of strangers. The nurse asked her gently if there was someone she wanted to call. Diane said no. She said it twice because the first time her voice broke and she didn't think the nurse heard her. 41 minutes later, her daughter was born. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, a full head of dark hair, just like her father's. Diane held her and counted her fingers and her toes, and she smiled the kind of smile that costs something, the kind you force onto your face so the people around you don't ask what's wrong. Because if they asked, she would have to say it out loud, and saying it out loud would make it real in a way that silence couldn't. Her husband, Marcus Whitfield, was 22 minutes away, in a hotel room on the other side of the city, with a woman named Renee Castellano. He would later say he didn't see his phone. He would later say he was asleep. He would later say a lot of things, but none of them would matter, because by the time he finally walked through that hospital door, 11 hours after his daughter took her first breath, Diane had already made a decision that would end his entire world as he knew it. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. She didn't cry when he walked in. That's the part that confused him most looking back. He'd braced himself for tears, for screaming, for the kind of scene he could apologize his way out of, the way he always had. Instead, Diane looked up from the bassinet, met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and said one sentence that he would replay in his head for the rest of his life. "You're not on the birth certificate." He laughed. He actually laughed because he thought it was a joke, a tired new mother's dark humor. Diane didn't laugh back. She turned back to her daughter and didn't say another word to him for the rest of the visit. He left 40 minutes later, confused, irritated, already composing the explanation he'd give her once she calmed down. She never calmed down. She got organized. To understand how Diane Whitfield ended up alone in a delivery room while her husband lay beside another woman, you have to go back 4 years, to the night they met at a charity gala neither of them wanted to attend. Diane was 31 then, a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm, sharp enough to spot a bad investment from across a room, but somehow blind to the man who would become the worst one she ever made. Marcus was magnetic in the specific way that successful, charming men often are, the kind of magnetic that makes you forget to ask the questions you'd ask anyone else. He ran a logistics company his father had built, inherited wealth dressed up as hustle, and he had a way of looking at Diane like she was the only interesting person in a room full of people trying to be interesting. They married 18 months later in a ceremony that made the local society pages. Diane's mother cried. Diane's father, a quiet man who'd spent 30 years as a postal worker, shook Marcus's hand and told him, "Take care of her. She doesn't ask for help, so you'll have to notice when she needs it." Marcus promised he would. For the first 2 years, he mostly did. The cracks started small, the way they always do. A late night that turned into a late morning. A business trip that didn't match the calendar Diane happened to glance at. A perfume on his collar that he explained away so smoothly, so immediately, that she almost felt foolish for noticing it at all. That was Marcus's particular skill. Not just lying, but making you feel crazy for catching him. By the time Diane got pregnant, she already knew, somewhere underneath the part of her that still wanted to believe him. She knew the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. She just didn't have proof yet, and Diane Whitfield was not a woman who acted without proof. So she waited, she watched, and she built a file. The woman's name was Renee Castellano, and Diane found out about her the way most betrayed wives do. By accident, through a careless mistake that men like Marcus always eventually make because they stop being careful once they believe they've gotten away with something. It was a hotel charge on a card Diane wasn't supposed to know existed, a secondary account Marcus had opened for business expenses that she'd stumbled across while doing what she did for a living, reading financial statements for a living, noticing what didn't add up. The Ridgemont Suites, Tuesday afternoon, $240. Marcus had told her he was in meetings downtown that day. Diane didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she did something far more dangerous to a man like Marcus. She got curious, professionally curious, the way she approached every financial irregularity she'd ever uncovered in 15 years of analyzing other people's money. She started keeping a folder. Hotel charges, late-night messages he thought he'd deleted, but that still lived in a shared cloud backup he'd forgotten he'd set up for her, back when he was trying to convince her he had nothing to hide. Receipts from restaurants where she'd never been taken. Renee Castellano was 26, a marketing consultant Marcus's company had hired 8 months earlier. Diane found a photo of her eventually. Confident smile, expensive highlights, the kind of effortless beauty that made Diane feel, for one humiliating moment, like she understood exactly what Marcus had been chasing. Younger, newer, someone who hadn't yet learned all of his patterns the way a wife of 3 years inevitably does. What unsettled Diane most wasn't the affair itself, but how long it had been running underneath her own life without her noticing. Message threads going back over a year, weekend conferences that were never on any actual conference schedule. A pattern, once she finally saw it laid out in black and white, that had clearly been part of Marcus's life since well before Diane had even gotten pregnant, meaning every ultrasound photo she'd excitedly shown him, every late night he'd rubbed her feet and asked how the baby was doing, had been happening in the same stretch of months he was building an entire second life 20 minutes away. Diane's pregnancy moved forward with Marcus playing 2 roles at once, and somehow believing he could keep them permanently separate. He was wrong, but it took Diane time to understand exactly how wrong, because the full picture didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces, the way most devastating truths do. A little more each week until one day you look up and realize you're holding something you can't put back together. She learned that Marcus had been seeing Renee for over a year, not the few months she'd initially assumed. She learned that he'd told Renee he and Diane were basically separated, living together for appearances, waiting for the right time to formally end things. A lie so absurd, so completely detached from the reality of their actual marriage, that Diane almost laughed when she found the message where he'd written it. Almost. She learned that Renee believed every word of it. Renee thought she was the one Marcus was building a future with, the one he was finally going to choose once he sorted things out at home. In a strange, complicated way, that detail haunted Diane more than the affair itself. Renee wasn't just the other woman in this story. She was being lied to in her own way too, just from a different angle of the same man, with a different set of false promises holding her in place. Diane never reached out to her. Not then. She wasn't ready, and more importantly, she wasn't finished gathering what she needed. Because somewhere around her 6th month, lying awake at 3 a.m. with her daughter kicking against her ribs, Diane Whitfield stopped feeling like a victim waiting for an explanation, and started feeling like exactly what she actually was. A financial analyst sitting on enough documented evidence to dismantle a man's entire life, the moment she chose to. She didn't choose yet. She had a baby to think about, a due date circled in red, and a decision that needed to be made with a clear head, not a broken heart. So she kept working. She kept smiling at dinner. She kept letting Marcus believe that his careful lies were still holding, right up until the night her contractions started and he didn't answer his phone. Because his phone was face down on a nightstand in a room at the Ridgemont Suites, 22 minutes away from the only woman who actually deserved his presence that night. The 11 hours Marcus spent unreachable became the single most important window of Diane's entire plan, though she hadn't fully realized it would be until she was living inside it. She had texted him at 3 a.m., calmly, factually, in labor, heading to St. Augustine Memorial. No response. She texted again at 5:15 after the epidural, her hands shaking slightly as she typed, "She's coming soon. Please call me back." Still nothing. By 7 a.m., as she pushed for the final time and heard her daughter's first cry fill a room with no one in it who shared her last name, Diane had stopped expecting an answer at all. What she didn't know yet, what she'd only learn weeks later, piecing it together from message timestamps and a confession Renee herself would eventually give her, willingly, once she understood the full picture, was that Marcus had, in fact, seen the first text. He'd glanced at his phone at 3:06 a.m., seen in labor, and made a decision. He told himself he had time. He told himself Renee needed him more that particular night, because Renee had been anxious all evening about a work presentation and didn't want to be alone. An irony so cruel that when Diane finally learned it, She didn't even feel angry anymore. She felt something colder than anger, something more useful. He'd put the phone on silent. He'd stayed. When he finally arrived at St. Augustine Memorial at 6:47 that evening, 11 hours after his daughter's birth, he walked in with a story half built in his head about a work emergency, a dead phone battery, a string of small lies stitched together the way he'd always done it. He never got to tell it. Diane's silence and that single sentence, "You're not on the birth certificate," ended the conversation before it began. What Marcus didn't understand, standing in that hospital room confused and indignant, was that Diane wasn't reacting to one missed night. She was acting on over a year of documented betrayal, finalized in a single moment that simply gave her the clarity to stop waiting and start moving. The unthinkable thing Diane did wasn't loud. It wasn't a scene in a hospital hallway or a dramatic confrontation caught on someone's phone camera. It was quieter than that, and far more devastating, because Diane Whitfield had spent her entire career understanding that the most powerful move in any negotiation is the one your opponent doesn't see coming until it's already done. 3 days after giving birth, while Marcus was still operating under the assumption that he simply needed to give her space and the marriage would eventually right itself, Diane met with a lawyer she'd quietly retained 6 weeks earlier. She filed for divorce. She filed for full custody, supported by a sleep-deprived, evidence-rich timeline of Marcus's absence during the most critical hours of his daughter's life. And she did something Marcus never saw coming, something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with simple, devastating accuracy. She sent Renee Castellano every piece of evidence she'd collected, not out of cruelty. Diane was clear with herself about that, even in the rawest moments. She sent it because somewhere in those long, sleepless nights with her newborn, Diane had decided that no woman deserved to keep believing a future was being built for her when it never actually existed at all. Renee didn't respond for 9 days. When she finally did, it wasn't anger directed at Diane. It was a single line. "Thank you for telling me the truth. I would have wanted to know." The two women who Marcus Whitfield had believed he could keep permanently separated, permanently unaware of each other, ended up speaking more honestly with one another in that exchange than either of them had ever spoken with him. Marcus's world didn't collapse all at once. It came apart the way a structure does when its foundation has quietly rotted for years. Slowly, then all at once, in a final moment that looked sudden to everyone watching from outside, but had been inevitable from the beginning. The divorce proceedings became public faster than he expected, partly because Diane's lawyer was meticulous, and partly because Marcus's own business partners, men who valued reputation above almost everything else, did not appreciate discovering that their company's name was now attached to a custody case built on documented infidelity and a year-long affair conducted under their client's own roof. 2 of his largest contracts quietly declined to renew. A board seat he'd been promised evaporated without explanation, though everyone involved understood exactly what the explanation was. He tried more than once to reach Diane directly, calls she didn't answer, an email pleading for one conversation, just one, a handwritten letter he had delivered to her new address, the one she'd moved into with her daughter 3 weeks after the birth, an apartment close enough to her parents that her mother could help with the baby, while Diane rebuilt the parts of her life that needed rebuilding. Diane read the letter once. She didn't respond. She'd already said everything that needed saying in the only language Marcus had ever truly respected: documentation, timelines, and consequence. Renee, for her part, ended things with Marcus the same week Diane's evidence reached her inbox. She didn't need time to think it over. She'd believed, for over a year, that she was the one Marcus was choosing, the one he was finally going to build a life with. Finding out that promise had never been real, that it had simply been the same line he used to keep 2 women patient at once, was enough on its own. She told a mutual friend, in words that eventually made their way back to Diane, that she'd realized she didn't want to spend her life with a man whose only consistent skill was making 2 women feel like they were the only one. Diane Whitfield's daughter is 2 years old now. Diane never remarried, though she'll tell you if you ask that she's not opposed to the idea. She's simply not in a hurry, not anymore, not after learning the hard way. What happens when you build your sense of safety around someone else's promises instead of your own clear eyes? She left her analyst job 18 months after the divorce was finalized and started her own financial consulting firm, specializing, with a kind of quiet, deliberate irony that she's fully aware of, in helping women understand and protect their finances during separations and divorces. Her client list grew faster than she expected. Word travels, especially among women who've sat across from a lawyer for the first time feeling lost, the way Diane once did before she decided never to feel that way again. Marcus, last anyone heard, sold his stake in the family logistics company 2 years ago and moved to a smaller city, away from the reputation that followed him in the one he'd built his life in. He sees his daughter on a court-mandated schedule that Diane has never once tried to interfere with, because whatever else is true about Marcus Whitfield, Diane made a decision early on that her daughter would never grow up believing her father was kept from her out of spite. That was never the point. The point was simply that Diane would no longer be the only one paying the cost of his choices. Renee Castellano and Diane Whitfield, against every expectation either of them once had, exchanged a handful of messages over the following year. Not friendship exactly, but something quietly resembling mutual respect. The specific, unrepeatable kind of understanding that only exists between two women who were both, in their own way, lied to by the same man. Renee eventually moved out of state for a new job, and the messages tapered off naturally, the way these things do. But Diane never forgot that single line. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Diane still remembers the exact moment, lying in that hospital bed at 2:47 in the morning when she made the decision not to call anyone, not to beg, not to fall apart in front of strangers. She didn't know yet exactly what she was going to do. She only knew that she was done being the person who waited to find out what Marcus would decide for her life. Everything that followed, the documentation, the divorce, the message to Renee, the new firm, the rebuilding, started in that single quiet decision, made alone, in a room with no one in it but her and her daughter. That, in the end, is the part of this story Diane comes back to most. When people ask her how she found the strength to do what she did, she tells them the truth. She didn't find strength that night. She found clarity. The strength came later, in all the ordinary days afterward, the ones nobody films, the ones where you simply get up and keep building the life you decided you deserved. If this story moved you, if Diane's quiet, deliberate, unthinkable choice meant something to you, that's exactly why we tell these stories. Thank you for staying until the end, and for walking through Diane's story with us. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Give this video a like if it touched you, and leave a comment letting us know your overall thoughts on Diane's journey. We read every single one, and we'll see you in the next story.